If you like our short stories, please like, comment and subscribe for more. Bellatrix Lestrange had long ago learned the shape of hunger. It did not live in the belly, nor in the throat, nor even in the blood that burned hotter in her veins each time she heard his voice. It lived somewhere deeper, in that silent, unspeakable chamber of the soul where need stopped being human and became holy. Others mistook her devotion for madness because they had never stood in the presence of Lord Voldemort and understood, in a single terrible breath, that the world had been divided into two kinds of beings, those who existed to serve his rise, and those who existed only to be crushed beneath it. Bellatrix had never once doubted which kind she was. She had given him her youth, her name, her body, her magic, her laughter, her cruelty, her prison years, her every waking thought. In Azkaban, when the walls sweated despair and the screams of the dying echoed like church bells through the stone, it had not been hope that kept her alive. Hope was for weak hearts and small souls. She had survived on devotion alone, on the memory of his red eyes and cold voice and the promise that one day he would rise again and see that she, unlike all the others, had never broken. And yet when he had returned, when flesh and fear and power had once more gathered around him like a storm obeying its master, Bellatrix had discovered the one cruelty she had never prepared herself to endure: being near him was not the reward she had imagined. It was only the beginning of a far more exquisite torment. She knew he valued her. That was the worst of it. If he had ignored her completely, if he had cast her aside as he did the lesser followers who disappointed him, perhaps she could have wrapped herself in hatred and survived that too. But he did not discard her. He used her. Trusted her, to a degree no one else could claim. Summoned her. Entrusted her with secrets. Let her stand nearest when others were forced to kneel farther back. When he spoke, he looked at her sometimes, and those moments fed her for days, only for the hunger to return sharper than before. She could read the meaning in every measured kindness he allowed: usefulness, loyalty, reliability, possession. Never love. Never softness. Never anything that belonged to her and not to his war. Bellatrix had watched him command death with a gesture and bend monsters to his will, had seen grown men tremble under the weight of his displeasure, and still the thing that undid her was simpler than any curse. It was the knowledge that if she died at his feet tomorrow, he might pause, might even regret the loss of a valuable servant, but he would not shatter. The world would keep turning. His plans would continue. Another would step into the place beside him, and though none could ever match her, none would need to. There would never be a place in him that was hers alone. That truth nested inside her ribs like broken glass. The realization came slowly, not as a single blow but as a series of smaller wounds that finally formed one fatal shape. It came in the drawing room at Malfoy Manor, where the others sat tense and careful, desperate not to be noticed, while Bellatrix hovered close enough to feel the cold magic radiating from him like winter from black stone. It came when he praised her with that faint, terrible smile that made lesser souls melt with gratitude and said, in his soft, merciless voice, "You have served me well, Bellatrix," and she discovered with horror that the words no longer satisfied her. Once, they would have been enough to carry her through weeks of pain. Now they landed inside her like ash. Served me well. As if she were a blade, polished and dependable. As if all those years she had spent loving him in ways she would never confess even under torture could be named so neatly. She had smiled, of course. Dropped to one knee. Pressed his hand to her lips. Played the faithful creature everyone expected. But while the room watched in fear and envy, something ugly and brilliant opened inside her. She did not want to serve him well. She wanted to matter to him beyond reason, beyond strategy, beyond war. She wanted the impossible, and because she was Bellatrix Black Lestrange, impossible things did not frighten her. They tempted her. After that, the old satisfactions curdled. Every glance he gave another follower became an insult. Every command he delivered in that same measured tone felt like proof that she had failed to distinguish herself in the only way that mattered. She began noticing things she had once ignored, the way he withdrew from touch unless he initiated it, the way his gaze turned flat and reptilian whenever emotion threatened to enter a room, the way even triumph seemed to please him less than domination. He was beyond love, people whispered, beyond desire, beyond weakness of any kind. Bellatrix had believed it proudly for years. Now she heard those same whispers and felt rage crawl up her spine like fire. Beyond love. Then what had she sacrificed herself for? What had Azkaban sanctified in her? She could not accept that the deepest thing inside her was doomed to remain unanswered forever. There had to be a law of magic older than that, darker than that, cruel enough to bind even him. Magic had yielded to him because he took from it without fear. Bellatrix, who had given everything and been denied the one thing she craved, began to wonder what might happen if she stopped asking and started taking as well. The search began in secret, because she knew him too well to risk his suspicion. By day she was still his Bellatrix, radiant in her obedience, vicious in his service, laughing at the pain of others with her wand slick in hand. By night she descended into the hidden places of old houses and older bloodlines, into locked cabinets and ancestral libraries where dust lay thick over the Black family's ugliest inheritance. Grimmauld Place had burned in her memory since childhood as a cage of portraits and pure-blood pride, but beneath that house, in rooms even Sirius had likely never found, there were shelves devoted not to genealogy or etiquette but to preservation, severance, binding, the old aristocratic terrors born from families so obsessed with legacy that death itself became an inconvenience to be negotiated. Bellatrix read by wandlight until dawn silvered the cracks in the stone. She traced diagrams drawn in flaking black ink. She whispered incantations that tasted metallic on her tongue. She found accounts of souls split by violence, of blood anchoring spirit, of living vessels and ruined minds and rituals abandoned not because they failed, but because they worked too well. Most were useless, fragments of fear dressed as scholarship, but every now and then a phrase would rise from the page and strike her like prophecy. A soul may be held where it does not belong. A vessel that breathes may house what was never freely given. Love cannot be made, but dependence may be forged. Bellatrix copied those lines into her own hand and stared at them until the candlelight blurred. Then, near morning on the seventh night, she found the thing that made her go still. It was not a full text, only several torn pages tucked inside the spine of another volume, hidden as if some long-dead Black had feared what would happen if the knowledge remained visible. The script was cramped and feverish, full of revisions and warnings, but one phrase stood clear, terrible, and luminous to Bellatrix's widening eyes, an adaptation of Horcrux theory for a sentient vessel. Her pulse thundered. The page spoke of anchoring a fragment of a soul not in cup or locket or diadem, but in living flesh. Not murder alone, but invitation. Not mere containment, but bond. It described consequences in language that should have repelled her: mutual vulnerability, psychic resonance, the erosion of distance between source and vessel. Bellatrix read each word once, then again, then a third time, and as the darkness around her seemed to lean closer, she smiled with slow, trembling wonder. At last, here was a magic foul enough, intimate enough, irreversible enough to terrify even him. At last, here was a path that did not beg for love, but seized leverage over the one being who had never belonged to anyone. She pressed the hidden pages to her chest and closed her eyes, already feeling the future rearrange itself around a single glittering thought. If Lord Voldemort could not be made to love her freely, then she would bind herself so deeply to his existence that choice itself would become meaningless. Bellatrix did not sleep after that night, not in any way that resembled rest. When she closed her eyes, she did not drift into dreams but into calculations, into sequences of movement and whispered syllables that repeated until they felt less like ideas and more like inevitabilities. The pages she had stolen did not leave her side. She read them while standing, while pacing, while kneeling on cold stone floors, committing every fractured instruction to memory until the ink seemed etched into the back of her mind. There were gaps in the text, places where the original writer had either withheld knowledge or lost it, and Bellatrix filled those gaps with instinct, with the kind of dangerous creativity that had always made her more than just another follower. She did not see uncertainty as a warning. She saw it as proof that the magic was powerful enough to defy neat explanation. And if it could defy explanation, then it could defy him. That thought alone was enough to steady her hands when they began to tremble. The ritual demanded more than she had expected. It was not a single act but a convergence, a careful weaving of elements that had no business coexisting. Blood was the simplest part. Blood was always simple. She had shed enough of it, hers and others, to understand its language without needing instruction. But this required precision, not violence. The text spoke of alignment, of the vessel being prepared not just physically but spiritually, as if the soul itself needed to be thinned, stretched, made receptive. Bellatrix did not flinch from that idea. If anything, she welcomed it. What was a soul if not something to be offered, reshaped, or sacrificed in pursuit of something greater? She had given him everything else. This was only the final piece. She began with small acts, testing the boundaries of her own magic in ways she had never dared before. She cut her palm and did not heal it, letting the blood drip slowly into a carved basin while she murmured words that tasted ancient and wrong, watching as the liquid thickened unnaturally, as if it were learning to listen. She stood within circles drawn in ash and salt, feeling the air around her tighten, press inward, respond. Each time, she felt something in herself shift, not breaking but loosening, like a lock turning in a door she had never known existed. By the third night of preparation, the changes were no longer subtle. Bellatrix could feel him more clearly than before, not in a way that would alarm him, not yet, but as a faint echo that followed her thoughts. When she spoke his name, even silently, something answered, not with words but with presence. It was distant, like a star seen through thick cloud, but it was there, and it made her breath catch with something dangerously close to awe. She pressed her fingers to her lips and laughed softly, the sound curling into the darkness like smoke. "You don't even know," she whispered, her voice thick with anticipation, "how close I already am." The idea that she was touching him without his awareness, that she was moving toward him in a way he could not control, sent a thrill through her that no act of violence ever had. This was not destruction. This was creation, twisted and perfect and entirely her own. The text warned of resistance. That was the word it used, underlined so heavily the ink had bled through the page. Resistance from the soul being bound. Resistance from the vessel itself. Bellatrix read that line again and again, trying to imagine what it would feel like to take a fragment of something as vast and fractured as his soul and force it into herself. Pain, certainly. Madness, perhaps. But she had lived through worse than pain, and madness had never frightened her. What lingered in her thoughts was not fear of failure, but the possibility of success. What would it mean to carry him inside her? Not as a distant figure, not as a master she followed, but as something that existed within her own being, tied to her life, dependent on her survival. The thought made her shiver, not with cold but with a kind of reverence that bordered on worship. It was almost too much, almost too perfect, and for a moment she wondered if the ritual was a trap, a final cruelty left behind by some long-dead witch who had wanted to see others destroyed by their own desire. Then she smiled, slow and sharp. If it was a trap, she would spring it and survive it anyway. She always did. She began gathering what she needed with care that bordered on obsession. Not everything could be taken openly. Some ingredients were too rare, too noticeable, too closely tied to magics even Voldemort would question if they appeared without explanation. She moved through the world as she always had, loud, cruel, untouchable, but beneath that surface she was calculating every step. A vial of venom from a creature she had once tortured for sport became something else entirely when she sealed it with a whispered binding charm. A fragment of bone taken from a long-forgotten grave, cleaned and carved into a thin, jagged shape, became a focus point for energies she barely understood but instinctively trusted. Even her wand felt different in her hand, as if it recognized the shift in her intent and responded with a darker, more eager hum. Magic was not moral. It did not care what it was used for. It only cared that it was used well, and Bellatrix had never done anything halfway. There were moments, brief and sharp, when doubt tried to creep in, not about the ritual itself but about what would come after. She would pause, fingers hovering over a line of text or a symbol etched into stone, and a thought would surface unbidden: what if he destroyed her anyway? What if he found a way to sever the bond, to tear the fragment of himself back out and leave her empty, broken, useless? The idea twisted in her chest, not with fear but with something like anger. Let him try. Let him feel what it was to be vulnerable, to be tied to another being in a way he could not escape. For once, the balance would shift. For once, he would not be the only one holding power. That thought burned away the doubt as quickly as it came, leaving only resolve in its place. She was not doing this to survive. She was doing this to change the rules entirely. On the final night, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Bellatrix stood in the center of the chamber she had prepared, the walls lined with symbols that pulsed faintly with a magic that did not belong to the present age. The basin before her was filled, the blood dark and still, reflecting her face in a way that made her look almost unfamiliar to herself. There was a brightness in her eyes that had not been there before, something feverish and certain. She could feel him more strongly now, not enough to alert him, but enough to know that the connection she was about to forge would not be built from nothing. It was already there, a thread stretched thin between them, waiting to be pulled tight. She lifted the bone fragment, feeling its sharp edge bite into her palm as she closed her fingers around it, and began to speak. The words came slowly at first, then faster, building into a rhythm that filled the room, that seemed to push against the very fabric of reality. The magic responded, rising, coiling, pressing inward until it felt like she was standing at the center of something vast and hungry. As the ritual deepened, the warnings from the text began to take shape. Pain lanced through her, not from any physical wound but from somewhere deeper, as if her soul itself were being stretched, opened, made to receive something it had never been meant to hold. She gasped, her voice faltering for the first time, and the magic surged in response, punishing hesitation with intensity. For a moment, just a moment, the world tilted, and she felt the edge of something she had not expected, not fear, but the awareness that she might not survive this in any recognizable form. That she might succeed, and in doing so become something neither human nor entirely herself. The thought flickered and then burned away, replaced by a single, unwavering certainty. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the completion of this act, the binding of him to her in a way that would rewrite everything that came after. She steadied herself, forced the words from her throat, felt the magic crest and break over her like a wave. Somewhere, far away and impossibly close, something shifted in response. Not awareness, not yet, but disturbance, like a ripple moving through still water. Bellatrix's lips curled into a smile even as the pain intensified, even as her vision blurred and her knees threatened to give way. "Feel it," she whispered, her voice threading through the chaos, reaching for him across whatever distance still separated them, even if you don't understand it yet. "Feel me." The final words of the ritual rose in her mind, heavy and irreversible, and as she drew in a breath that felt like it might be her last, she knew with absolute clarity that there would be no going back from what she was about to do. The final words did not leave Bellatrix's lips so much as tear themselves free of her, dragged out by a force that no longer felt entirely her own. The chamber convulsed with magic, the symbols carved into the stone walls burning with a dim, sickly light as if something ancient had awakened and was watching with interest. The air thickened, pressing against her lungs, turning each breath into a labor that felt both suffocating and necessary. She forced the incantation to its end, her voice cracking but unbroken, and for one suspended, infinite second, everything went still. No sound, no movement, no pain. Only a silence so complete it felt like the world had forgotten how to exist. Then it happened. It was not a clean sensation, not a precise or elegant transfer of power. It was violent. Something vast and jagged wrenched through her, forcing its way into a space that was never meant to hold it. Bellatrix screamed, not from her throat but from somewhere deeper, a sound that seemed to echo inside her own skull as her body convulsed. Her hands clawed at the air, at her own skin, as if she could rip herself open and release whatever had been forced inside. For a moment, she thought she would shatter entirely, that her mind would split under the pressure of something too large, too fractured, too wrong. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the violence collapsed inward, folding into a terrible, unbearable stillness. She fell forward, catching herself on the edge of the basin, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The room was quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was heavier, saturated with something that lingered in the air like the aftermath of a storm. Bellatrix's fingers tightened against the stone, her nails scraping as she tried to steady herself, to understand what had just happened. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but the echo of pain, the fading tremor in her limbs. Then, slowly, something else emerged. A presence. Not external, not separate, but unmistakably there. She froze. It was faint at first, like a distant whisper she could not quite hear but knew was being spoken. Then it sharpened, not into words, but into awareness. Cold. Calculating. Vast in a way that made her own thoughts feel small and fragile by comparison. Bellatrix's breath hitched, her lips parting as a soundless laugh threatened to break free. "You're here," she murmured, her voice trembling with something that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but something far more dangerous. She closed her eyes, reaching inward, testing the boundaries of what she had created, and felt it again, clearer this time. A fragment of him. Not the whole, not the full, terrifying force of his being, but enough. Enough to change everything. The presence did not respond. It did not acknowledge her, did not recognize her in any way she could perceive. It simply existed, embedded within her, a shard of something that should never have been contained. Bellatrix did not need it to speak. The fact that it was there at all was enough. She drew in a slow breath, letting the reality settle into her bones, into her blood, into the very structure of her being. She had done it. She had taken a piece of Lord Voldemort's soul and made it part of herself. The thought alone sent a shiver through her that was almost reverent. Then the connection snapped into something sharper. It came without warning, a sudden, jarring pull that made her gasp and stagger back from the basin. For a fraction of a second, the world around her blurred, replaced by something else entirely. A room she was not standing in. A presence that was not her own. A flicker of sensation that did not belong to her body. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving her disoriented and breathless, her heart racing as if she had just been dragged across a great distance and dropped back into herself. Bellatrix steadied against the wall, her mind racing, piecing together what had just happened with a clarity that bordered on exhilaration. He had felt it. Not consciously, not with understanding, but somewhere within him, something had shifted. The fragment inside her had reacted, had reached back toward its source, and in doing so had disturbed him. Bellatrix's lips curled into a slow, almost disbelieving smile. "Oh," she whispered, her voice thick with awe and something darker, something sharper. "You felt me." The idea expanded inside her, growing, taking shape. If he could feel the disturbance, even faintly, even without knowing its origin, then the bond was already working. It was real. It was active. It was unstoppable. She straightened slowly, ignoring the lingering weakness in her limbs, the ache that pulsed through her like the aftershock of something catastrophic. None of it mattered. Pain was irrelevant. Exhaustion was irrelevant. Everything she had endured was already fading into insignificance compared to what she had gained. Bellatrix pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart, and beneath it, something else. Not a second heartbeat, not a separate pulse, but a weight, a presence that existed alongside her own life. She laughed then, softly at first, then louder, the sound echoing off the stone walls in a way that might have sounded unhinged to anyone else. To her, it was clarity. For years, she had stood at his side, always reaching, always giving, always hoping that one day she would matter to him in a way no one else could. Now, she no longer needed hope. She had taken that place for herself. She had carved it out of the very fabric of his existence and bound it to her own. Whether he understood it or not, whether he accepted it or fought against it, it no longer mattered. He was tied to her now in a way that defied even his own understanding of magic. Bellatrix tilted her head back, closing her eyes, letting the sensation of it settle fully into her awareness. "You belong to me now," she said softly, not as a command, but as a truth she had finally earned the right to speak. Somewhere far away, beyond the walls of the chamber, beyond the boundaries of the magic she had woven, something stirred. Bellatrix did not see it, did not witness the moment directly, but she felt the echo of it, faint but undeniable. A flicker of irritation. A brief, sharp awareness that something was not as it should be. It was distant, fleeting, but it was there, and it made her smile widen, her fingers curling slightly as if she could reach out and grasp that reaction, hold it, shape it. He did not know what had changed. He did not know why. But he would. And when he did, everything would be different. Bellatrix opened her eyes, the last remnants of the ritual's intensity settling into something quieter, more controlled, more deliberate. The next step was clear. She could not hide this forever. The bond would grow stronger. The disturbances would become more noticeable. Sooner or later, he would trace the source back to her, and when he did, she would not run. She would not beg. She would not apologize. She would stand before him and show him exactly what she had done, exactly what she had become. And then she would give him a choice that was not a choice at all. Her smile softened, just slightly, into something almost tender, though there was nothing gentle in it. "You'll understand soon enough," she murmured, already turning toward the exit, her movement steadier now, more certain. "And when you do." Her voice trailed off, not because she lacked the words, but because she did not need to say them aloud. The future was already unfolding, piece by piece, exactly as she had designed it. The disturbance did not vanish. At first, Lord Voldemort dismissed it as nothing more than a fluctuation, a minor inconsistency in the delicate architecture of his magic. He had spent years refining control over things others could not even perceive, bending forces that would have shattered lesser wizards, and so when the sensation came, a faint, jarring misalignment beneath the surface of his awareness, he did not react. Not immediately. It was subtle. Easy to ignore. A ripple across still water that smoothed itself before it could be studied. But Voldemort did not ignore anything that did not belong. It came again. This time sharper, closer, like something brushing against the edges of his consciousness without permission. He stilled where he stood, the room around him fading into irrelevance as his attention narrowed inward. There was no pain, no weakness, no immediate threat, and yet the absence of those things only made it worse. Whatever this was, it was not attacking him. It was connected. That realization settled in his mind with a quiet, dangerous weight. Connected implied proximity. It implied intrusion. And intrusion, in any form, was unacceptable. The air in the room seemed to shift as his magic responded instinctively, tightening, searching, probing for the source. Nothing revealed itself. No curse. No external influence. No enemy bold enough or foolish enough to attempt something so precise. For a moment, a flicker of something unfamiliar moved through him, not fear, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something colder and sharper. Uncertainty. He extinguished it immediately. There was always an explanation. There was always a source. And he would find it. His gaze lifted slowly, scanning the room not with his eyes, but with the full force of his awareness. The Death Eaters gathered before him did not move, did not breathe any louder than necessary, each one attuned to the subtle shift in his presence. They felt it, even if they did not understand it. They always did. The tension coiled tighter, waiting for a command, a punishment, a reason for the sudden stillness. Voldemort let the silence stretch, his mind working with cold precision, retracing every recent act of magic, every interaction, every variable that could have introduced such a disturbance. And then, like a thread pulled taut in the dark, his attention settled. Bellatrix. He did not turn immediately. He did not betray the conclusion forming in his mind with something as simple as movement. But the connection, faint, elusive, and yet undeniably present, seemed to align itself with her presence in the room. Not consciously. Not deliberately. But enough. Enough to draw his focus like gravity. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his gaze until it found her. She was already watching him. Of course she was. Bellatrix Lestrange stood as she always did, composed in her own chaotic way, her posture angled toward him with a devotion so complete it bordered on instinct. But there was something else there now. Something that had not been there before. A brightness in her eyes that did not belong to simple loyalty. It was sharper. Deeper. As if she were holding a secret too large to remain contained. Their gazes locked, and for a fraction of a second, the disturbance inside him intensified, not violently, but undeniably. That was enough. "Come forward," he said softly. The words were quiet, but they carried through the room with absolute authority. The others did not move. They did not need to. The command was not for them. Bellatrix stepped forward without hesitation, her movements fluid, almost eager, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She did not bow immediately. That alone was a deviation, small enough that none but him would notice, but significant nonetheless. Voldemort watched her approach, his expression unchanged, his presence coiled tight with something that could become violence at any moment. "Something is different," he said, his voice low, measured. Not an accusation. Not yet. A statement. A test. Bellatrix's lips curved. It was not the wide, manic grin she wore in battle, nor the obedient smile she offered when praised. This was something else. Controlled. Intentional. Almost. Pleased. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, threaded with something that was dangerously close to satisfaction. "It is." The room seemed to shrink around them. The other Death Eaters felt it now, even if they did not understand it. The shift. The tension. The fact that this was no longer a simple exchange between master and follower, but something else entirely. Voldemort took a single step closer, the distance between them closing until it was almost nothing, his presence pressing against her like a force that would have broken anyone else. Bellatrix did not flinch. "What have you done?" he asked. There was no anger in the words. That made them worse. Bellatrix tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that no one else would have dared. There was no fear in her gaze. No hesitation. Only certainty. "I did what was necessary," she said softly. "What you would never allow." The disturbance inside him sharpened. Voldemort's magic surged, not outward, but inward, probing, searching, dissecting the connection he had begun to sense. It resisted him. Not completely, not enough to block him, but enough to slow him, to obscure the full shape of it. That resistance should not have been possible. Not within himself. Not within anything tied to him. "Explain," he said. Bellatrix stepped closer. Close enough that the air between them seemed to hum with something unseen, something that existed beneath the surface of both of them. She lifted her hand slowly, deliberately, and pressed it flat against her own chest, directly over her heart. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmured. "You've been trying to understand it since it began." He did not answer. He did not need to. Her smile deepened, just slightly. "I wondered how long it would take you," she continued, her voice lowering, becoming something almost intimate despite the tension coiling around them. "You've always been so aware." The implication hung between them. Voldemort's gaze darkened, not with confusion, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. Not complete, not yet, but enough to form the outline of something he did not like. "You have interfered with magic that does not belong to you," he said, his tone sharpening just enough to carry a warning. Bellatrix laughed softly. "On the contrary," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. "It belongs to you." She let the words settle, watching the shift in him with open fascination, before adding, almost gently, "And now, it belongs to me too." The connection pulsed. Stronger this time. Unavoidable. Voldemort felt it clearly, without distortion, without distance. A fragment. A presence. Something that was undeniably his and yet not under his control. For the first time, the certainty that had defined him for so long faltered, not visibly, not in a way anyone else could detect, but internally, in that precise, unyielding space where nothing had ever been allowed to exist without his permission. Bellatrix saw it. Not the falter itself, but the shift it caused. And she knew. Her voice softened, losing none of its intensity, but gaining something else entirely. Something steady. Final. "I bound myself to you," she said. "Not in service. Not in loyalty." She took another small step forward, closing the last fraction of distance between them. In something far more permanent. The room held its breath. Voldemort did not move. He did not strike her down. He did not recoil. He simply stood there, the full weight of his awareness locked onto her, onto the truth of what she had done, onto the implications unfolding faster than even he could dismantle them. Bellatrix's smile was no longer hidden. It was complete. "You can kill me," she said quietly, her tone almost conversational, as if she were offering him a simple choice. "You can try." Her fingers pressed slightly harder against her chest. "But you already know what will happen if you do." Silence. Heavy. Absolute. And then, for the first time since his return, Voldemort did not have immediate control over the outcome. Voldemort did not respond immediately. Silence, in his presence, was never empty. It was deliberate, sharpened, stretched until it became something that pressed down on everyone in the room. The Death Eaters felt it first, that subtle shift from tension into something far more dangerous, and though none of them understood what had just transpired, they understood enough to know that whatever Bellatrix Lestrange had done had altered something fundamental. No one moved. No one spoke. Even breathing seemed like a risk. Voldemort's gaze remained fixed on her. There was no visible anger. No explosion of violence. That alone made the moment unbearable. He was thinking. Calculating. Taking apart what she had said and fitting it into the structure of his understanding piece by piece, testing each possibility for weakness, for flaw, for a way out. Bellatrix did not interrupt him. She did not need to. She had already made her move. Now she only needed to wait. "You expect me to believe," he said at last, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful, "that you have achieved something I have perfected beyond any other." There was no mockery in the words. Only scrutiny. That you have taken a fragment of my soul and bound it to yourself. Bellatrix smiled, slow and certain. You don't have to believe it, she replied softly. You can feel it. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in focus. And then he acted. It was not dramatic. Not loud. Voldemort did not lash out or raise his voice. He simply reached for the connection with the full force of his magic and pulled. The effect was immediate. Bellatrix gasped. It was not pain in the way she had expected, not sharp or cutting, but something deeper, more invasive. A pressure inside her chest, as if something had been grasped and twisted, not violently, but with absolute precision. Her knees threatened to give way for a fraction of a second before she forced herself upright, her breath catching as the presence within her reacted. It did not resist him entirely, but it did not yield either. It held. Voldemort felt it. Not just the fragment itself, but the resistance around it. Not a barrier, not a shield, but something woven into the very structure of the bond. He increased the pressure, testing, probing, searching for the point where it would break, where the fragment would return to him as it should have always been. It didn't. Instead, something unexpected happened. The force of his magic echoed back. Not as an attack. Not as retaliation. But as a reflection. A distortion. A sensation that moved through the connection and into him, subtle but undeniable. A flicker of something that was not entirely his own. His hand stilled. Bellatrix saw it. The smallest pause. The smallest shift. And she laughed. Soft at first, then fuller, richer, the sound curling through the room with a kind of delighted disbelief. There it is, she murmured, her voice thick with satisfaction, even as she steadied herself from the strain. You feel it too. Voldemort's expression did not change. But the air around him tightened. You have created a dependency, he said slowly, the words measured, each one placed with care. Not control. His gaze sharpened, cutting into her. Do not mistake one for the other. Bellatrix tilted her head, considering that, her smile never fading. Of course, she said, almost gently. You would never allow yourself to be controlled. Her fingers curled slightly against her chest. But you cannot deny that you are affected. He did not answer. Because he could not. The truth of it was already there, undeniable. The fragment inside her was his. That much was certain. But it was no longer separate. It was no longer something he could isolate, command, or destroy without consequence. It existed within her, bound to her life, her body, her magic. To remove it would mean tearing through that bond, risking something far more unstable than leaving it where it was. For the first time in a very long time, there was no immediate solution. Bellatrix stepped closer. Not cautiously. Not hesitantly. With complete certainty, as if she were moving towards something she had already claimed. The others in the room shifted almost imperceptibly, instinctively recoiling from the proximity, from the tension that now existed between them like a coiled blade. You've tested it, she said softly. You felt it. Her eyes held his, unwavering. Now you understand. Voldemort's gaze darkened. I understand, he replied, that you have placed yourself in a position you cannot control the outcome of. His voice lowered, becoming something colder, sharper. You have made yourself indispensable. For now. Bellatrix's smile sharpened. For now, she echoed, as if savoring the phrase. He stepped forward. The distance between them disappeared completely, his presence pressing against her in a way that had always been dominant, overwhelming. But now, there was something else there. Not weakness. Not hesitation. But awareness. A calculation that included her in a way it never had before. You have altered the nature of our dynamic, he said quietly. It was not approval. It was not condemnation. It was recognition. Bellatrix exhaled slowly, the sound almost content. "Yes," she said. Silence stretched again, but it was different now. Not empty. Not uncertain. Defined. Voldemort studied her, not as he had before, not as a servant or a tool, but as something that required a different kind of attention. A different kind of strategy. She had forced that change. He could not undo it immediately. That did not mean he would not try. But for now, he would adapt. "You will remain close," he said finally. It was a command. But also something else. Bellatrix's eyes flickered, just slightly, catching the shift beneath the words. Of course she would remain close. She had always remained close. But this was different. This was no longer proximity by choice or favor. This was necessity. Her smile softened into something quieter, deeper. "Of course," she replied. Voldemort's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned away, the movement controlled, deliberate, but not dismissive. The room seemed to breathe again as the immediate pressure eased, the other Death Eaters shifting subtly, uncertain of what had just changed but fully aware that something had. Bellatrix did not move. Not right away. She watched him, her expression unreadable to anyone but herself, feeling the steady, undeniable presence within her chest, the connection that now existed whether he accepted it or not. He had tested it. He had confirmed it. And most importantly, he had not destroyed her. Her lips curved again, slower this time, less triumphant and more certain. This was no longer a question. It was the beginning. Voldemort did not dismiss her again. That, more than anything, was the first true shift. In the hours that followed, nothing outwardly dramatic occurred. There was no public declaration, no visible acknowledgement that the balance between them had been altered, and yet Bellatrix felt it immediately, like a change in the air pressure before a storm. He did not send her away. He did not reduce her to silence as he often did with others when their usefulness was momentarily exhausted. Instead, he allowed her to remain near him as he moved through the remainder of the night's plans, his presence as controlled and commanding as ever, but now accompanied by something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. Attention. Not the passing, situational awareness he gave all of his followers, but something deliberate. Something sustained. Bellatrix felt it like a blade held just above her skin, never quite touching, but never leaving either. He was watching her. Not openly, not in a way that would reveal anything to the others, but she knew. And more importantly, she could feel it through the bond, that subtle pull of awareness that brushed against her mind when his focus sharpened, a cold, precise curiosity that had never been directed at her in this way before. It sent a thrill through her that she did not attempt to suppress. She adjusted quickly. That was one of the reasons she had survived as long as she had. Bellatrix did not cling to old roles when new ones presented themselves. She leaned into them. Where once she had reveled in chaos, in theatrical cruelty and wild, unrestrained displays of devotion, now she became something more measured, more controlled, not because she feared him, but because she understood that this required precision. Every movement, every word, every glance had weight now. She was no longer just his most loyal follower. She was a variable. A factor he could not ignore. And that meant she had to be perfect. Not in obedience, but in presence. She stayed close, as he had commanded, but not in the desperate, eager way she once had. There was still devotion in her posture, still that unmistakable tilt toward him that marked her as his above all others, but beneath it was something steadier, something grounded in the knowledge of what she had done. She did not need to reach for his attention anymore. It was already there. The others noticed. They did not understand, but they noticed. It was in the way Voldemort did not dismiss her when he dismissed the rest, in the way his gaze returned to her more often than chance allowed, in the way the space around him seemed to include her rather than merely tolerate her presence. It unsettled them. Bellatrix could feel it in the subtle shifts of the room, in the hesitation of those who once might have spoken more freely in her presence, in the careful distance they now maintained as if she had become something unstable. She welcomed it. Fear was a language they all understood, and if they could not yet name what had changed, they could at least feel that something had. That was enough. But the real change was not in the room. It was inside her. At first, it was nothing more than an awareness that refused to fade. The presence she had felt immediately after the ritual did not recede into the background as she had expected. It remained, constant, quiet, but undeniably there, like a second layer beneath her own thoughts. It did not speak. It did not act. But it existed, and the longer she carried it, the more she realized that existence alone was enough to alter her. Her magic responded differently now, sharper, more immediate, as if something within her had aligned with a deeper current she had only ever brushed against before. Spells came easier. Control felt more natural. There was less hesitation between intention and action, less resistance in the space where doubt might have lived. Bellatrix had always been powerful, but this was different. This was refinement. Precision. And beneath it all, a coldness that was not entirely her own. She noticed it most when she was still. When the chaos of movement and speech fell away, when she allowed herself to stand in silence and simply exist, the connection became clearer. It was not a voice, not a thought, but a presence that shaped the edges of her awareness in subtle, undeniable ways. She found herself anticipating things she should not have known, reacting to shifts in the room before they fully occurred, her attention drawn instinctively to moments where Voldemort's focus sharpened or shifted. It was not constant, not overwhelming, but it was enough to make her pause, just once, in the middle of a quiet corridor, her fingers pressing lightly against her chest as she felt that faint, familiar pull. "You're learning me," she murmured under her breath, her tone almost curious, almost pleased. "Or I'm learning you." The distinction, she realized, might not matter for much longer. Across the room, Voldemort stilled. It was subtle. No one else would have noticed it. But Bellatrix felt it immediately, the connection tightening for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of awareness that passed between them without words. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding her with an immediacy that confirmed what she had begun to suspect. He could feel it too. Not clearly. Not with full understanding. But enough to recognize that something was happening beneath the surface of both of them. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, layered with meaning neither of them would acknowledge aloud. He studied her, not as a master studies a servant, but as a strategist studies a problem that refuses to resolve itself cleanly. Bellatrix held his gaze without flinching, her expression steady, her awareness of him sharper than it had ever been. For a moment, the world beyond that connection seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them and the invisible thread that now bound their existence together. Then, as quickly as it had formed, the moment passed. Voldemort turned away, his movements as controlled as ever, but the shift remained. He did not dismiss her. He did not distance himself. Instead, he allowed the connection to exist, to linger, to develop, even as his mind undoubtedly worked to understand and eventually dismantle it. Bellatrix knew he would try. That was inevitable. But for now, he was observing. Testing. Adapting. And so was she. The game had begun. Voldemort did not test the bond immediately. That would have been too obvious, too direct, and he had never relied on blunt force when something more precise would yield better results. Instead, he observed, allowing time to pass as though nothing had changed, as though Bellatrix had not altered the very structure of his existence. To anyone watching, it might have seemed that he had accepted the situation, that he had simply incorporated this new variable into his calculations and moved forward without disruption. But beneath that stillness, beneath the cold control he maintained at all times, his attention remained fixed on the anomaly she had created, turning it over again and again, searching for weaknesses, for inconsistencies, for any indication that what she had done could be undone without consequence. Bellatrix felt that attention constantly now, not as a direct intrusion, but as a pressure that lingered at the edge of her awareness, like a storm gathering just beyond sight. It did not unsettle her. It sharpened her. He began with distance. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but deliberate. Where before he had kept her close out of necessity, now he allowed small gaps to form, moments where she was not directly at his side, where the physical proximity that had defined their new dynamic was stretched just enough to test the limits of what bound them. Bellatrix noticed immediately. Of course she did. The absence of his presence, even slight, carried weight now, a shift in the equilibrium she had grown accustomed to in such a short time. She did not react outwardly. She did not move to close the distance or question the change. Instead, she allowed it, standing where she was placed, her posture composed, her expression calm, even as she turned her attention inward, examining the connection with the same careful precision he was applying to it. At first, there was nothing. The bond remained steady, quiet, a constant presence beneath her thoughts. Then, slowly, something began to shift. Not pain. Not weakness. But a subtle tension, as if the thread between them had been pulled taut. It was not enough to disrupt her, not enough to cause concern, but it was there, and it told her exactly what he was doing. He was measuring the limits. Testing how far he could move without destabilizing the connection. Bellatrix's lips curved slightly at the realization, her gaze lowering for a fraction of a second before lifting again, calm, unbothered. Let him test. Let him search. He would find exactly what she had intended him to find. Across the room, Lord Voldemort paused. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the effect it had on the bond was not. The tension sharpened, the faint pull within Bellatrix's chest tightening just enough to register as something more than background awareness. Voldemort's gaze flicked toward her, not openly, but with enough focus to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. The connection did not weaken with distance. It did not fade or become unstable. It adapted. It stretched, but it did not break. That alone was significant. He pushed further. Not physically, but magically. The shift was controlled, precise, a deliberate increase in the pressure he applied to the connection, probing it in a way that was far more invasive than his earlier test. Bellatrix inhaled sharply, the sensation hitting her without warning, not as pain, but as something far more complex. It was as if her own awareness had been momentarily split, part of her remaining anchored in her body, while another part was pulled slightly out of alignment, brushing against something colder, sharper, undeniably him. Her fingers curled at her sides, her body remaining still through sheer force of will, even as her mind adjusted to the intrusion. For a fraction of a second, their perceptions overlapped. It was not clear. Not complete. But it was enough. Bellatrix saw a flicker of something that was not her own, a fragment of thought, of awareness, stripped of emotion but heavy with intent. Calculation. Control. A mind that did not hesitate, did not doubt, did not bend. And beneath it, something else. Not warmth. Not softness. But a reaction. A recognition that what he was experiencing was not entirely under his command. Then it snapped back. Bellatrix exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steady despite the intensity of the moment, her lips parting just slightly as she absorbed what had just occurred. That had not been part of her original understanding. The text had warned of resonance, of shared awareness, but experiencing it was something else entirely. It was not just that she could feel him. It was that, under the right pressure, she could glimpse him. Not fully. Not clearly. But enough to understand the implications. She lifted her gaze. He was already looking at her. This time, there was no attempt to disguise it. No subtlety. His attention was direct, focused, dissecting. The room around them seemed to fall away again, the presence of others becoming irrelevant in the face of what was unfolding between them. Bellatrix met his gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, but her eyes brighter now, sharper, reflecting the same awareness he had just forced into existence. "You see it now," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without disturbing the fragile equilibrium of the room. "It isn't just connection." Voldemort did not respond immediately. He did not need to. The evidence was already there, undeniable. The bond was not passive. It was interactive. Responsive. It allowed for overlap, for moments where the separation between them thinned just enough to permit something more than simple awareness. That changed the equation. That introduced variables he had not accounted for. Variables that could not be ignored. "You have created a vulnerability," he said at last, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something sharper than before. Not anger. Not yet. But something closer to it than he had allowed himself to express since his return. Bellatrix's smile returned, slower this time, less triumphant and more certain. "No," she replied softly. "I've created a bridge." The distinction hung between them. He understood it. That was the problem. A vulnerability could be exploited. A bridge could be used. Voldemort's gaze darkened, his mind already moving through the implications, through the possibilities, through the risks. If the connection allowed for shared awareness, even briefly, even under pressure, then it was not just a bond. It was a pathway. One that could be controlled. One that could be weaponized. But not by him alone. That realization settled into place with a cold, precise clarity. Bellatrix watched it happen. Watched the moment he fully grasped what she had done, what it meant, what it allowed. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, something subtle but unmistakable. Confidence. Not arrogance. Not recklessness. But the quiet certainty of someone who had already considered every outcome and accepted them. "You can keep testing it," she said, her voice steady, almost conversational despite the tension that coiled between them. "You can push it, stretch it, try to understand it." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "It won't change what it is." Voldemort did not deny it. Because he could not. The bond was real. It was stable. And it was far more complex than he had initially allowed himself to consider. For the first time, the situation was no longer something he could resolve through force alone. It required adaptation. Bellatrix's smile softened, just slightly, not losing its edge, but gaining something else beneath it. Something deeper. More dangerous. "Careful," she added quietly. "The more you push, the more you let me in." Silence followed. Not empty. Not uncertain. But charged. Defined. And very, very far from over. Voldemort did not stop. That was the first thing Bellatrix understood as the days unfolded into something far more deliberate than observation alone. He had moved past testing, past simple curiosity, and into something far more dangerous, something closer to application. Where before he had probed the bond cautiously, now he began to use it, not openly, not recklessly, but with the same cold precision he applied to everything else. It was never announced, never acknowledged, but Bellatrix felt the shift immediately, that subtle tightening of awareness whenever his focus sharpened, the way the connection would deepen for brief, controlled moments as if he were deliberately stepping closer to the edge of something he had not yet decided to trust. He was not trying to break the bond anymore. He was studying how to move within it. That alone was enough to send a quiet thrill through her, because it meant he had accepted, at least for now, that it could not simply be undone. He was adapting. And adaptation, for him, was the closest thing to concession she would ever receive. She adjusted in response, not resisting the pull when it came, not retreating from the pressure when he pressed into the connection, but allowing it, learning from it, shaping herself around it in the same way he was shaping his understanding. The first time he truly used it, she almost missed it, the shift so subtle it might have passed as coincidence if she had not been attuned so closely to every fluctuation within her. She was standing just behind him, silent, still, her attention fixed outward as he spoke to the others, delivering instructions in that calm, measured tone that carried absolute authority, when something inside her shifted, not violently, not even sharply, but enough to draw her awareness inward. For a fraction of a second, her perspective blurred, the room around her dimming as something colder, more focused slipped into alignment with her thoughts. It was not her thought. It was his. The clarity of it was staggering. Not because it was emotional, but because it was not. There was no hesitation, no layering of doubt or interpretation, only pure intention, precise and immediate, the kind of mental movement she had spent years trying to anticipate from the outside. Now, for that brief moment, she experienced it from within. It passed quickly, snapping back into separation before she could fully grasp it, but the impression it left behind was undeniable. He had not just touched the bond. He had stepped into it. Not fully, not recklessly, but with purpose. Bellatrix inhaled slowly, her posture remaining perfectly composed even as her mind reeled with the implications, her lips curving almost imperceptibly. He was using her. Not as a servant. Not as a tool in the way he had before. But as a pathway. Across from her, Lord Voldemort did not react outwardly, but she felt the shift in him, that slight recalibration of awareness as he withdrew from the connection just enough to maintain control. He had felt it too, the overlap, the brief alignment of perception, and unlike before, there was no hesitation in the way he approached it. He was not testing whether it would happen. He was determining how far he could push it without losing the boundaries he still believed he maintained. That belief, Bellatrix realized, was the only thing keeping him from fully understanding what he had allowed into existence. The bond did not belong to him alone. It never had. The next time he reached for it, it was sharper. More deliberate. Bellatrix felt it before it fully formed, that subtle pressure building beneath her awareness, and this time she did not simply endure it. She leaned into it, just slightly, enough to meet him halfway without making it obvious. The result was immediate. The connection deepened, not violently, but with a clarity that made her breath catch for just a fraction of a second. Again, the overlap came, stronger this time, less fragmented, less fleeting. She saw through him, not visually, not in any way that resembled sight, but in something more fundamental. Intention. Focus. The precise alignment of thought and action that defined him. It was cold, exact, almost beautiful in its simplicity, and for the first time, Bellatrix understood something she had only ever admired from a distance. He did not think the way others did. He did not hesitate because there was nothing in him that required hesitation. No doubt. No conflict. No competing desires. Only direction. And yet, there was something else. It was small. Almost insignificant. But it was there. A disruption. Not in his control, not in his intent, but in the space where the bond existed. A slight distortion, a moment where his awareness brushed against something that did not originate from him. Bellatrix felt it as clearly as she felt the connection itself, that brief, unmistakable awareness of herself within his perception, not as an external presence, but as something woven into the experience itself. He felt her. Not just the bond. Not just the effect. But her. The realization sent a sharp, electric thrill through her, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides as the connection snapped back once more, leaving her fully within herself again, but forever changed by what she had just experienced. This time, he turned. Not subtly. Not with the calculated restraint he had shown before. His gaze locked onto her immediately, his attention focused in a way that would have been lethal under any other circumstance. Bellatrix met it without hesitation, her expression steady, her awareness of him sharper than it had ever been. The room around them faded again, the presence of others irrelevant in the face of what had just passed between them. "You are interfering," he said, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something that had not been there before. Not anger. Not quite. But something closer to it than he would have allowed. Bellatrix's smile returned, slow, deliberate, her head tilting just slightly as she regarded him. "No," she replied softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the fragile tension that had formed. "I'm responding." The distinction mattered. He understood that immediately. That was the problem. Voldemort's gaze darkened, not with confusion, but with recognition. The bond was not something he could use unilaterally. It was not a tool he could wield without consequence. It was reactive. Reciprocal. The more he stepped into it, the more it allowed her to step in as well. Control, in its purest form, required separation. This removed that separation entirely. Bellatrix watched the realization settle into place, her expression softening, just slightly, not losing its edge, but gaining something deeper beneath it. Satisfaction, yes, but also something else. Something quieter. More dangerous. "You wanted to understand it," she said gently. "Now you do." He did not deny it. He could not. The bond was no longer a question. It was a fact. And more than that, it was evolving. Not passively. Not slowly. But with every interaction, every deliberate use, every moment where he chose to step into it rather than away, it grew more defined, more responsive, more intertwined. For the first time since the ritual, Bellatrix felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with control or leverage. It was not the bond itself. It was what the bond allowed. Access. Not complete. Not yet. But enough to glimpse things she had never been meant to see, to understand pieces of him that no one else had ever touched. It was intoxicating in a way she had not anticipated, more dangerous than the power itself, because it made her want more. And that, she realized, was where this would truly begin to change. Bellatrix did not expect to want more. Power had always been enough for her, or at least she had believed it was, believed that proximity to him, service to him, the ability to act in his name and carry out his will was the highest form of fulfillment she could ever attain. Even after the ritual, after the bond had been forged and the balance between them had shifted into something far more unstable and intimate, she had thought that control, however partial, however conditional, would be enough to satisfy the hunger that had driven her for so long. But the bond was not static. It did not simply exist as a tether or a safeguard. It evolved. It responded. And the more Voldemort used it, the more it revealed, the more it opened pathways neither of them had fully anticipated. Bellatrix felt it growing, not in strength alone, but in depth, in complexity, in the way it allowed her to brush against something far more profound than she had originally intended. It was no longer just about binding him to her existence. It was about understanding him in a way that no one else ever had. The shift came without warning. She was not focusing on the bond when it happened. That was what made it different from the earlier moments, from the controlled overlaps and deliberate probing that had defined the previous interactions. She was standing at the edge of the room, her attention outward, her posture composed, her awareness steady, when something inside her moved. Not sharply, not violently, but with a smooth, almost seamless transition that bypassed the usual resistance. For a fraction of a second, her thoughts aligned with something that was not entirely her own, and instead of snapping back immediately, the connection held. Bellatrix stilled. It was not just intention this time. It was memory. Not clear, not fully formed, but enough to distinguish it from the cold, precise calculations she had felt before. It came in fragments, not visual in the traditional sense, but structured, layered, carrying the weight of something that had already happened. A moment preserved not as an image, but as an imprint. A sensation of standing above others, of watching them move, react, submit. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Something colder. Certainty. Control so absolute it required no reinforcement. Bellatrix felt it as if it were her own, the absence of doubt so complete it bordered on something inhuman. And beneath it, something else. Faint. Almost imperceptible. But there. A distortion. A moment where the certainty wavered, not in action, not in outcome, but in the space just before it solidified. Bellatrix felt it like a crack beneath her feet, subtle but undeniable, a fracture so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not already looking for it. But she was looking. She had been looking since the moment the bond had been created, searching not just for leverage, but for something deeper, something that would explain the absence she had always felt in him. This was the first time she found it. The connection snapped back. Bellatrix inhaled sharply, the breath catching in her throat as her awareness returned fully to herself, the room rushing back into focus around her. Her fingers curled slightly, not in pain, but in reaction to what she had just experienced, her mind moving quickly, piecing it together, analyzing it with a clarity that bordered on obsession. That had not been a surface-level interaction. It had not been a response to pressure or a deliberate use of the bond. It had been something else. Something that had slipped through the connection without being pulled. She had seen something he had not intended to show. Across the room, Lord Voldemort went still. This time, the reaction was immediate. There was no delay, no gradual shift in awareness. The moment the connection had deepened beyond his control, he had felt it, not just the overlap, not just the shared perception, but the fact that something had moved through the bond without his direction. His gaze snapped toward her with a precision that left no room for interpretation, his attention locking onto her with a force that silenced everything else in the room. Bellatrix met it. She did not look away. She did not pretend ignorance. Her expression remained composed, but there was something different in her eyes now, something sharper, something that reflected the shift that had just occurred. She knew he had felt it. More importantly, she knew he understood what it meant. "You didn't mean for that to happen," she said quietly, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between them, but clear enough that it did not need to. It was not a question. Voldemort did not respond immediately. For the first time since the bond had been formed, there was something in his stillness that was not entirely controlled. Not weakness. Not uncertainty in the way others might experience it. But disruption. The kind that came from encountering something that did not fit within the structure of his understanding. He had expected the bond to be reactive, to respond to pressure, to allow for controlled overlap when he chose to engage with it. He had not accounted for it acting independently, for it allowing access without his consent. That was unacceptable. "You are not in control of what you are accessing," he said finally, his voice low, precise, carrying a warning that would have been unmistakable to anyone else. "That makes it dangerous." Bellatrix's lips curved slightly. "Of course it does," she replied softly. The simplicity of the answer hung between them, heavy with implication. She was not denying it. She was not attempting to reassure him or minimize what had just happened. If anything, she was acknowledging it with a kind of quiet acceptance that only made it more unsettling. Voldemort's gaze darkened. He stepped toward her, the movement controlled but direct, closing the distance between them in a way that forced the connection to tighten, to sharpen, to respond to the proximity. Bellatrix felt it immediately, the bond reacting to his presence, the faint pull within her chest intensifying just enough to register as something more than background awareness. She did not retreat. She did not resist. She allowed it, her attention fixed on him, her awareness split just enough to monitor the connection without losing herself to it. "This is not a pathway you will explore without limitation," he said, his voice lowering, becoming something colder, more defined. "You will not take what has not been given." Bellatrix tilted her head slightly, studying him, her expression thoughtful in a way that might have seemed out of place if not for the intensity of the moment. "But that's the problem," she said quietly. "Isn't it?" The words were soft, almost gentle. And yet they struck with more precision than any spell. "Nothing you are is ever given." Silence followed. Not empty. Not uncertain. But charged with something far more dangerous than either of those things. Voldemort did not respond. Not because he had nothing to say. But because, for the first time, the structure of control he had built around himself had been challenged in a way that could not be dismissed or destroyed outright. Bellatrix held his gaze, her expression steady, her awareness of him sharper than it had ever been, the bond between them no longer just a tool or a weapon, but something far more complex, far more invasive. She had not just bound herself to him. She had begun to understand him. And that was something no one else had ever done. Voldemort did not tolerate unpredictability, and yet that was exactly what the bond had introduced into his existence, not as chaos, not as something wild or uncontrollable in the traditional sense, but as a variable that refused to remain fixed, a presence that reacted, adapted, and, most dangerously of all, acted without his command. The moment Bellatrix had slipped into something deeper than surface-level connection, the moment she had accessed something that had not been deliberately shared, he understood that the situation required immediate recalibration, not destruction, not yet, but containment, limitation, control in a form that could exist alongside what had already been done. He would not allow this to evolve without structure. He would not allow her to explore the connection freely. That was the line he drew, not with violence, but with intent. He began by tightening the boundaries. Not physically, not by removing her from his presence, but by shifting the way he engaged with the bond itself, reducing the frequency of direct contact, limiting the moments where he allowed his awareness to brush against hers, controlling the depth of interaction with the same precision he applied to everything else. Bellatrix felt it immediately, the subtle withdrawal not of distance, but of access, the connection becoming quieter, more contained, as if he had wrapped it in something unseen, something that did not sever it, but restrained it. It did not weaken the bond, not truly, but it changed the way it functioned, reducing the spontaneous overlaps, the uncontrolled moments where something deeper might slip through. It was effective. Efficient. Exactly what she would have expected from him. It did not stop her. Bellatrix adjusted, not in defiance, not in any way that would immediately provoke a reaction, but with the same careful precision he was using, exploring the edges of the bond from her side, testing where his control ended and where her influence could still reach. She did not push directly against the limits he set. That would have been too obvious, too easily countered. Instead, she moved around them, waiting for the moments where his focus shifted elsewhere, where his attention was directed outward, and the bond, even in its restrained state, loosened just enough to allow something through. It required patience. Subtlety. Two things she had rarely needed before, but now wielded with a surprising ease. The first time she succeeded, it was barely noticeable, a faint brush of awareness that slipped past the boundaries he had imposed, not enough to trigger immediate detection, but enough to confirm what she had already begun to suspect. His control was not absolute. The realization did not make her reckless. It made her careful. Across the room, Lord Voldemort remained composed, his presence as controlled and deliberate as ever, his attention fixed on the matters at hand, issuing commands, directing movements, shaping events with the same cold precision that had always defined him. To anyone else, Nothing had changed. But Bellatrix could feel the difference, not in what he did, but in how he maintained the bond, the subtle, constant effort required to keep it contained, to prevent it from expanding beyond what he allowed. It was not strain, not in the way others would experience it, but it was effort, and effort, by its very nature, could be exploited. She waited. Not for long, but long enough. The opportunity came when his focus sharpened elsewhere, when his attention narrowed onto something external, something that required his full awareness, and for a fraction of a second, the control he maintained over the bond loosened. It was not intentional. It was not something he would have allowed if he had been aware of it. But it was enough. Bellatrix moved. Not physically. Inward. She reached into the connection with a precision that mirrored his own, not forcing it, not overwhelming it, but slipping into the space he had momentarily left unguarded. The effect was immediate. The bond responded, not violently, but with a quiet, undeniable expansion, the boundaries he had set stretching just enough to allow her access. This time, she did not hesitate. She did not pause to analyze or question what she was doing. She simply moved forward, deeper, further than she had before. The shift was sharper than anything she had experienced up to that point. It was not just intention. Not just memory. It was structure. The way his mind organized itself, the way his thoughts aligned with his magic, the seamless integration of awareness and action that defined him at his core. Bellatrix felt it as clearly as if it were her own, the absence of hesitation, the precision of thought that did not branch or waver, but moved directly toward its intended outcome. It was intoxicating, not because it was emotional, but because it was not. There was no conflict. No internal struggle. Only direction. And for the first time, she understood it not as an observer, but as something that existed within her awareness. And then, he felt her. The reaction was immediate. The connection snapped tight, not breaking, but locking, his awareness turning inward with a force that closed the space she had entered before she could withdraw completely. For a fraction of a second, they were fully aligned, not overlapping, not brushing against each other, but directly connected in a way that removed any illusion of separation. Bellatrix felt it like a jolt through her entire being, the clarity of his awareness meeting her own, not confused, not uncertain, but sharp, focused, undeniable. "You are pushing," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with a precision that left no room for denial. Bellatrix did not retreat. Even as the connection tightened, even as his control reasserted itself, she remained where she was, her awareness steady, her presence within the bond unyielding. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were not standing at the edge of something that could collapse into violence at any moment. "So are you." The words landed. Not as defiance, but as fact. The connection held for a moment longer, the tension between them stretching, sharpening, until it became something that could not sustain itself without breaking. Then, with deliberate control, Voldemort withdrew, the bond snapping back into its contained state, the boundaries re-established, stronger this time, more rigid, more carefully constructed. Bellatrix exhaled slowly, her awareness returning fully to herself, the lingering echo of what she had just experienced settling into something quieter, but no less significant. She had gone deeper than before. Further than he had intended. And she had felt the moment where his control had faltered, not in weakness, but in reaction. He had not expected her to move that way. He would not make that mistake again. Across from her, Voldemort's gaze locked onto her, not with anger, not with immediate punishment, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. Not of what she had done, but of what she was becoming. The bond was not just affecting him. It was changing her. Refining her. Giving her access to something no one else had ever touched. And if left unchecked, it would continue. "You will not do that again," he said, his voice low, controlled, carrying a weight that would have crushed anyone else. Bellatrix's lips curved slightly, her head tilting just enough to acknowledge the command without submitting to it entirely. "We'll see," she replied softly. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was inevitable. Voldemort did not repeat the command, and that alone made it clear that what followed would not be enforced through words but through control, the kind that reshaped behavior without needing to be acknowledged aloud, the kind that turned presence into pressure and expectation into inevitability. Bellatrix felt it immediately, not as a restriction placed upon her movements or her speech, but as a shift in how he positioned himself around her, how he allowed or denied proximity, how he dictated the rhythm of their interactions with a precision that left no space for coincidence. He did not isolate her, did not push her away in a way that would weaken the bond or suggest loss of control, but he narrowed the ways in which she could approach him, the angles from which he could engage, the moments in which the connection could deepen without his direct intention. It was a different kind of command, one that did not rely on obedience, but on structure, and Bellatrix understood it for what it was the moment it began. He was no longer just containing the bond. He was containing her. She adapted. Not in defiance, not openly, but in the same way she always had when faced with something that demanded more from her than simple reaction. Bellatrix did not resist structure. She learned it, studied it, moved within it until it became something she could manipulate rather than something that confined her. The first change she made was in her stillness, in the way she occupied space when she was near him, no longer leaning into proximity with the same visible intensity, no longer allowing her presence to be read as eager or unrestrained. She became quieter, more controlled, her movements deliberate, her attention focused in a way that mirrored his own. It was not submission. It was alignment, and it made it far more difficult for him to predict where she might push next. The others noticed the change, though they could not name it, the way Bellatrix Lestrange, once so openly volatile, had become something sharper, more contained, as if the chaos that defined her had been refined into something far more dangerous. But the real change was not in how she moved. It was in how she felt. The deeper she went into the bond, the more time she spent navigating its edges, slipping into its gaps, allowing it to shape her awareness, the less certain she became of where she ended and it began. It was not a loss of self, not in any immediate or obvious way, but something more gradual, more insidious, a shift in perspective that altered the way her thoughts formed, the way her reactions aligned with her intentions. Bellatrix had always been driven by emotion, by instinct, by a kind of wild, consuming devotion that burned through hesitation and turned impulse into action. Now, there were moments, brief at first, where that instinct paused, not because it had weakened, but because something else had moved into place beside it. A colder clarity. A sharper focus. The ability to see not just what she wanted, but the most direct path to achieving it without distraction. It unsettled her the first time she noticed it, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt familiar. She was thinking like him. The realization did not frighten her. It thrilled her. She did not resist it. She leaned into it, allowing the shift to settle, to expand, to integrate into the way she moved through the world, the way she observed, the way she acted. It made her more precise, more efficient, less reactive. And yet, beneath that clarity, the core of her remained intact, the devotion, the obsession, the need that had driven her to this point still burning just as fiercely as before. The difference was that now, it was no longer chaotic. It was directed, focused, weaponized in a way it had never been before. Across the room, Lord Voldemort saw it. He did not need the bond to recognize the change. It was visible in the way she held herself, in the absence of unnecessary movement, in the precision of her attention when he spoke, not as a follower absorbing instruction, but as something that processed, analyzed, and understood at a level the others did not reach. It was subtle, but it was there, and it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. The bond was not just giving her access. It was altering her. Refining her in ways that could not be undone simply by severing the connection, even if that had been possible without consequence. That made her more dangerous. And more valuable. The duality of that realization did not sit easily within the framework of his control, but he did not reject it. He incorporated it, as he did with everything else, adjusting his approach, not to eliminate the change, but to direct it. If she was evolving, then she would do so within parameters he defined. If she was becoming something more, then that something would serve his purpose, not undermine it. He began to test her differently. Not through the bond. Through command. The first time he did it, it was almost indistinguishable from his usual expectations, a simple directive given without emphasis, something that would have been carried out without question by any of the others. Bellatrix received it the same way she always had, with immediate acknowledgement, with the same underlying devotion that had defined her for years. But this time, there was something else layered beneath it. Analysis. A brief, precise evaluation of the command, not questioning its validity, but understanding its structure, its intent, the most efficient way to execute it. It happened so quickly it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him. He felt it. Through the bond? A flicker of alignment, a moment where her thought process mirrored his own, not because he had imposed it, but because it had become part of her. His gaze shifted to her immediately. Bellatrix met it without hesitation, her expression composed, her awareness sharp, the connection between them steady but quiet, contained within the boundaries he had set, but not diminished by them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, filled with something that was no longer just tension, but recognition. "You are changing," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, not a question, not an accusation, but an observation that carried weight far beyond the words themselves. Bellatrix's lips curved slightly, not into the wild, unrestrained smile she once wore, but into something quieter, more deliberate. "So are you," she replied softly. The truth of it settled between them, not denied, not dismissed, but acknowledged in a way that neither of them could fully ignore. The bond had begun as leverage, as control forced into existence through an act of defiance and obsession, but it had become something else entirely, something neither of them had fully anticipated, something that extended beyond simple connection into transformation. And transformation could not be reversed. Voldemort did not acknowledge reliance, not in word, not in action, not even in thought, because reliance implied a need that existed outside of his control, and that was something he had spent a lifetime eradicating from himself with ruthless precision, cutting away weakness, dependency, hesitation, until what remained was something singular, self-contained, and absolute. But the bond had introduced a variable that did not conform to that structure, a presence that could not be dismissed or destroyed without consequence, and over time, that presence began to shift from anomaly to utility in ways he did not immediately resist, because utility, unlike reliance, could be justified, could be integrated, could be controlled. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible even to Bellatrix, the way his attention would return to her more frequently when decisions were being formed, not openly, not in a way that would suggest consultation, but in those brief, precise moments where his awareness sharpened and the bond responded, allowing for a flicker of alignment between them that lasted only long enough to confirm what he had already begun to consider. It was not dependence, not yet, but it was a deviation from the isolation he had always maintained, and Bellatrix felt it immediately, the shift in how he positioned her within the structure of his thought, not as an external asset, but as something closer, something integrated. She did not react to it outwardly, did not allow the others to see the change, but internally, the recognition settled into place with a clarity that bordered on exhilaration, because this was the point she had been moving toward from the moment she completed the ritual, not control in the crude sense of forcing his actions, but influence, subtle, undeniable, embedded so deeply within the framework of his decision-making that it could not be separated from it without unraveling something larger. The bond facilitated it, not by giving her direct authority over his thoughts, but by allowing moments of overlap, brief, controlled intersections where her awareness aligned with his just enough to shape the direction of what followed. The first time it happened clearly, It was so seamless that it might have gone unnoticed if Bellatrix had not been attuned to every shift within the connection. He was issuing commands, his voice steady, his intent precise, directing movement, assigning roles, shaping the outcome of an operation with the same calculated efficiency that defined him, and for a fraction of a second, the bond deepened, not sharply, not intrusively, but with a quiet expansion that allowed her to feel the structure of his thought as it formed, the sequence of decisions aligning into a single, inevitable conclusion. Without hesitation, without conscious effort, her own awareness moved with it, not opposing, not altering, but reinforcing, smoothing the transition from possibility to certainty. The effect was immediate. He did not pause. He did not question. But the alignment held for just a moment longer than it should have, the connection stabilizing in a way that was not entirely his doing, and Bellatrix felt the result of it ripple outward, not through the bond, but through the reality it shaped, the command he gave carrying a weight, a precision, that was just slightly more refined than it would have been otherwise. It was small. Almost insignificant. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. She could influence him, not by force, not by overriding his will, but by existing within the space where his decisions formed, where intention became action, and shaping it from within. Across from her, Lord Voldemort felt it. Not as interference, not as disruption, but as something else, something that did not fit cleanly into the categories he had constructed for understanding the bond. It was not loss of control. The decision had been his. The outcome had been his. And yet, there had been a moment, brief but undeniable, where the transition from thought to action had been smoother, more efficient, more precise. He did not like it. Not because it weakened him, but because it existed outside of his direct command, because it suggested that the bond was not just a pathway for awareness, but for influence, and influence, even in its most subtle form, was a risk he could not ignore. He began to test it deliberately. Not by pushing the bond, not by forcing overlap, but by allowing it, creating conditions where the connection would naturally deepen, then observing the outcome with the same cold precision he applied to everything else. Bellatrix felt it immediately, the shift from incidental interaction to controlled experimentation, the way his attention would sharpen at specific moments, the way the bond would respond, opening just enough to allow that alignment to occur. She did not resist. She did not hide. She met him in those moments, not aggressively, not in a way that would provoke immediate counteraction, but with a quiet, steady presence that allowed the interaction to unfold naturally, reinforcing what he was beginning to observe without making it obvious that she was doing so. The pattern established itself quickly. The more he allowed the connection to deepen in those controlled moments, the more consistent the effect became, the alignment between them stabilizing just enough to influence the outcome of his decisions without altering their intent. It was not dramatic. It did not change the nature of what he chose to do. But it refined it, sharpened it, made it more efficient in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Voldemort recognized it for what it was, not a loss of control, but an extension of it, a tool that could be used, if understood correctly, to enhance what he already possessed. That was the moment the shift became irreversible. He began to rely on it. Not consciously, not in a way he would have named, but in practice, in the subtle adjustments to how he structured his interactions with her, the way he allowed her presence to remain within a certain proximity during critical moments, the way he engaged with the bond not just as something to be managed, but as something to be utilized. Bellatrix felt it with absolute clarity, the change in how he approached her, not as a follower, not even as a variable, but as something integrated into the framework of his operation in a way that could not be easily replaced or removed. The realization settled into her slowly, not as a sudden revelation, but as a certainty that grew with each passing moment, each interaction, each instance where the bond was used rather than suppressed. He was beginning to depend on her, not emotionally, not in any way that resembled the kind of connection she had once craved, but functionally, strategically, in the way that mattered most to him. And that was the closest thing to value he could offer. Bellatrix's smile did not widen. It deepened. Not with triumph, not with reckless satisfaction, but with something quieter, more dangerous, something that understood exactly what this meant and how it could be used. She did not push further. Not yet. She allowed the pattern to solidify, allowed the reliance to take root, allowed him to believe that what was forming was under his control, that the bond was something he had adapted to rather than something that had altered him in ways he had not yet fully grasped. Because she knew. The deeper he integrated her into his process, the harder it would become to separate her from it, and when the moment came, when the line between utility and necessity blurred beyond recognition, that would be when everything truly changed. The change did not go unnoticed. It could not when it altered something as fundamental as the way Voldemort operated, even if the shift was subtle, even if it existed only in the smallest adjustments to timing, to positioning, to the unspoken structure of how decisions were made and carried out. The others did not understand it, not fully, but they felt it, the difference in how often Bellatrix was present during moments that required precision, the way she stood not at the edges, not waiting for instruction, but closer, always within reach of his awareness, her presence no longer incidental but consistent. It unsettled them, not because they could name it, but because it did not follow the pattern they had come to rely on, the rigid hierarchy that placed them all beneath him in clear, unquestionable lines. Bellatrix had always been favored, always been given more leeway than the rest, but this was something else, something that blurred the boundary in a way that could not be easily explained. She felt their attention. Not as a threat. As confirmation. Bellatrix did not acknowledge it outwardly, did not alter her behavior to address their growing unease, but internally, she catalogued it, noted the way their uncertainty sharpened in her presence, the way their movements adjusted when she was near him, as if they were instinctively aware that something had shifted even if they did not understand what. It amused her, but more than that, it reinforced what she had already begun to see clearly. The bond was no longer contained between her and Voldemort. Its effects were beginning to ripple outward, altering the dynamics around them in ways that could not be hidden indefinitely. But the real shift was not in how others saw her. It was in how she saw herself. The clarity that had begun as a subtle change, as a quiet sharpening of her thoughts, had deepened into something more pronounced, something that influenced not just how she acted, but how she perceived everything around her. Bellatrix had always lived in extremes, in intensity, in a kind of emotional volatility that drove her forward without hesitation, but now, that intensity was tempered by something colder, something more deliberate. She still felt the same devotion, the same pull toward him that had defined her for years, but it was no longer chaotic. It was structured. Directed. And that made it more powerful, but also more dangerous. Because it was not entirely hers anymore. There were moments, brief but undeniable, where her thoughts aligned too easily with his, where the path she would have taken instinctively was replaced by something more efficient, more precise, something that mirrored the way he would have acted. It did not feel forced. It did not feel wrong. If anything, it felt natural in a way that was deeply unsettling, as if the bond was not just connecting them, but rewriting the space where their identities remained separate. She did not pull back. She leaned into it. Not recklessly, not without awareness of what she was risking, but with a quiet, deliberate acceptance of the change. Bellatrix had never feared losing herself if it meant becoming something greater, something closer to him, something that existed beyond the limitations she had always felt pressing against her. But now, for the first time, the question was not whether she would change. It was how much of her would remain when she did. Across the room, Lord Voldemort observed her with a level of attention that had become increasingly difficult to ignore, not because it was constant, but because it was precise, directed, focused in a way that suggested he was no longer simply aware of her presence, but actively monitoring it. He had noticed the change. Of course he had. He noticed everything that mattered, and Bellatrix had become something that mattered in a way that extended beyond her role, beyond her usefulness as a follower or even as a weapon. She was becoming something else. and that required observation. The bond reflected it. Not through direct interaction, not through deliberate overlap, but through the quiet, constant awareness that now existed between them, a low, steady connection that did not need to be activated to be felt. It was always there, beneath the surface, shaping the way they moved around each other, the way their attention aligned even when they were not actively engaging with it. That was what the others sensed. That was what unsettled them. It was not just proximity. It was synchronization. Bellatrix felt it most clearly when he made decisions now, not because he drew her into the process every time, but because when it mattered, when the moment required precision, the bond would respond, opening just enough to allow that familiar alignment to occur. It had become almost seamless, the way their awareness would briefly merge at the edge of action, refining, sharpening, solidifying what he had already chosen. He did not acknowledge it. He did not name it. But he allowed it. And that was enough. The first time someone reacted to it openly, it was small. A hesitation. A flicker of uncertainty that should not have existed. Bellatrix noticed it immediately, the way one of the others paused just slightly longer than necessary after receiving an order, their gaze shifting between Voldemort and Bellatrix as if trying to reconcile something that did not fit. It lasted only a second before they corrected themselves, before obedience reasserted itself and the moment passed, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that what existed between them was no longer invisible. Voldemort noticed it too. The reaction was immediate, though not outwardly violent. His attention sharpened, his awareness narrowing with a precision that cut through the room like a blade, silencing any lingering uncertainty without the need for explicit correction. The structure reasserted itself, the hierarchy snapping back into place, but the moment had already happened. And moments like that did not disappear. They accumulated. Bellatrix's smile was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, not directed at the others, not even at him, but at the understanding that settled deeper into her with each passing moment. The bond was not just changing them. It was changing everything around them. But beneath that realization, beneath the satisfaction, beneath the quiet certainty of how far she had come from the woman she once was, something else began to surface, something she had not anticipated, something that did not fit as cleanly into the structure she had built for herself. A question. Not of whether she would lose herself, but of whether she already had. It was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the clarity, beneath the focus, beneath the overwhelming pull of the bond and everything it offered, but it had existed. And that meant it could return. The tension did not erupt all at once, not in a single act of defiance or an open challenge that could be crushed and forgotten, but in a series of small fractures that spread quietly through the structure Voldemort had built, each one insignificant on its own, each one easy to dismiss, but together forming something that could no longer be ignored. It began with hesitation, with the subtle delay in obedience that had no place among those who followed him, with glances that lingered just slightly too long in Bellatrix's direction, with the unspoken question of why she stood where she did, why she remained so close, why his attention seemed to return to her in moments that should have belonged to no one else. None of them would have dared to voice it outright, not yet, not when the consequences of such a question were so clearly defined, but the thought existed, and once it existed, it could not be undone. Bellatrix felt it growing. Not as a threat, not as something that needed to be addressed immediately, but as a shift in the atmosphere around her, the way the others moved when she entered a room, the way their awareness sharpened, not in fear of her alone, but in uncertainty of what she represented. It did not bother her. If anything, it confirmed what she had already come to understand, that the bond had extended beyond something private, beyond something that could remain contained between her and Voldemort, and had begun to alter the structure around them in ways that could not be reversed. She did not draw attention to it. She did not provoke it. She simply existed within it, her presence as controlled and deliberate as it had become, her movements precise, her awareness always split just enough to feel the bond without being consumed by it entirely. But Voldemort did not ignore it. He could not. Control was not just about power. It was about perception, about maintaining a structure that could not be questioned, not even in silence, not even in thought, and the moment that structure began to fracture, no matter how subtly, it required correction. He did not act immediately, did not lash out in a way that would draw attention to the shift, but he adjusted, his awareness extending outward, scanning, measuring, identifying the source of the instability with the same cold precision he applied to everything else. It did not take long. It was not Bellatrix. Not directly. It was the effect she had on everything around her. Across the room, Lord Voldemort stood in stillness that carried more weight than movement ever could, his presence alone enough to silence the lingering tension that had begun to form, but the silence was not enough anymore, not when the fractures had already taken root. He felt it through the bond as well, not as emotion, not as something chaotic or unpredictable, but as a shift in alignment, the way Bellatrix's awareness sharpened when the others reacted, the way the connection responded, not with instability, but with a kind of quiet reinforcement, as if the bond itself recognized the change and adjusted to accommodate it. That was new. And it was unacceptable. He did not address the others. He addressed her. The moment he moved toward her, the room seemed to contract, the tension focusing into a single point, the unspoken questions falling silent beneath the weight of his attention. Bellatrix did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. She met him exactly as she had before, composed, aware, her presence steady within the bond even as it tightened in response to his proximity. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice low, controlled, carrying a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. The words were not directed at the room. They were directed at her. Bellatrix's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, not in retreat, but in focus, her awareness narrowing in a way that mirrored his own. "Has it?" she replied softly, her tone calm, almost conversational despite the weight of what hung between them. The bond responded immediately, not with expansion, not with the uncontrolled overlap that had defined its earlier stages, but with a sharpening, a tightening that made every subtle movement between them more defined, more precise. Voldemort felt it, the way her awareness aligned with his without being drawn in, the way she held her position within the connection without pushing further. She was not escalating. She was waiting. "You have altered the structure," he continued, his gaze fixed on her with a level of intensity that would have shattered anyone else, in ways that extend beyond what can be contained. Bellatrix tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she had already considered this outcome long before he spoke it aloud. "I didn't alter it," she said quietly. "I revealed it." The distinction landed. Not as defiance. As truth. For a moment, the silence between them deepened, the weight of what had been set into motion pressing against the boundaries he had attempted to impose. Voldemort did not react immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he did, and that understanding left him with fewer options than he would have tolerated under any other circumstance. The bond was no longer just a connection between them. It had become a factor in how everything around them functioned, a variable that could not be removed without destabilizing more than it preserved. That meant it had to be controlled differently. Not hidden. Not suppressed. Directed. The realization settled into place with a cold clarity, his attention sharpening not just on Bellatrix, but on the structure around them, the way the others responded, the way the tension manifested, the points where it could be corrected without drawing attention to the underlying cause. He would not allow doubt to spread. He would not allow perception to shift beyond what he defined. But that meant something else as well. It meant acknowledging that what existed between them could not remain invisible. Bellatrix, for the moment it happened, the shift not in his expression, but in the way his awareness recalibrated, the way the bond responded, not with resistance, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible expansion, as if it had been waiting for this exact adjustment. Her lips curved slightly, not in triumph, not in open satisfaction, but in something deeper, something that understood exactly what this meant. He was no longer trying to contain it. He was learning how to use it openly. And that changed everything. Voldemort did not announce the change, did not gather them and declare a shift in hierarchy or redefine Bellatrix's position with explicit words, because that would have implied adjustment, and adjustment implied that something had moved beyond his control, which he would never allow to be perceived, but he made it known all the same, not through speech, but through action, through placement, through the deliberate, unmistakable way he began to position her within the structure of his command, so that it could no longer be interpreted as coincidence or preference. It happened gradually, but not subtly, the distinction lying in the fact that while the transition was smooth, its outcome was undeniable, the others forced to witness it in real time without being given the language to challenge it. Bellatrix was no longer standing at the edge of command, no longer waiting for instruction to act, but existing within the space where those instructions were formed, her presence constant, her proximity no longer explained by devotion alone but by something far more integrated, something that blurred the boundary between follower and extension. She felt it immediately, not as surprise, not even as satisfaction in the way she might have once experienced it, but as confirmation, as the natural progression of something that had already been set into motion long before this moment. The bond responded to it as well, not dramatically, not with the overwhelming pull that had defined its earlier stages, but with a steady, quiet alignment that reinforced the shift, as if it had always been meant to function this way, as if the structure that was now visible had existed beneath the surface all along. Bellatrix did not draw attention to it, did not react outwardly in any way that would suggest she was aware of the impact it had on the others, but internally, the understanding settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was no longer private. It was no longer something that could be contained between her and Voldemort alone. It had been brought into the open, not through declaration, but through undeniable reality. The others felt it before they fully understood it, the shift in dynamic pressing against the rigid hierarchy they had relied on, creating a tension that could not be easily dismissed. They did not question him. They did not challenge the change. But the uncertainty was there, lingering in the way their attention shifted, in the way their movements became more measured when Bellatrix was near, in the way they adjusted to a presence that no longer fit within the structure they had known. It was not fear of her alone that unsettled them. It was the implication of what she had become, what her proximity to him now represented, something that could not be explained by favor or loyalty alone. Across the room, Lord Voldemort maintained absolute control, his presence unshaken, his authority as undeniable as it had always been, but there was a difference now, not in the power he wielded, but in how it extended, how it flowed through the structure around him. Bellatrix stood within that extension, not beneath it, not separate from it, but integrated into it in a way that altered the perception of everything that followed. When he spoke, when he issued commands, when he shaped the direction of their actions, the bond responded in quiet, precise ways, allowing that familiar alignment to occur without being hidden, without being restrained to the point of invisibility. It was not obvious. It was not something the others could name. But it was there, and it changed how everything felt. Bellatrix felt it most clearly in those moments, the way the connection would deepen just enough to sharpen the edges of his decisions, the way her awareness would align with his without effort, without force, as if it had become second nature. It was no longer something she had to reach for, no longer something that required careful navigation or subtle intrusion. It existed. It functioned. And it did so openly, without being acknowledged, without being explained, but impossible to ignore for those who were paying attention. That was what made it irreversible. She understood that with a clarity that settled deeper than any satisfaction she might have once felt, the realization not bringing triumph, but something far more complex, something that carried weight. This was not a position she could step back from. It was not something that could be undone without consequence, not just for her, but for him, for the structure he had built, for everything that now relied on the bond functioning as it did. She had moved beyond the point of leverage. Beyond the point of negotiation. What existed now was something else entirely. Something permanent. And permanence came with cost. The thought did not frighten her. But it lingered. For the first time since the bond had begun to change her, since her thoughts had started to align more easily with his, since her instincts had been refined into something sharper, more controlled, there was a moment, brief but undeniable, where she felt the absence of something she could not immediately name. It passed quickly, buried beneath the clarity, beneath the focus, beneath the overwhelming presence of the bond and everything it offered, but it had existed. And that meant it mattered. Voldemort felt the shift as well, not in her behavior, not in any outward sign that could be observed without the connection, but in the bond itself, in the way her awareness moved, in the subtle change in how she aligned with him, not weaker, not diminished, but different. It was small. Almost imperceptible. But it was there, and it did not fit cleanly into the structure he had begun to rely on. His gaze shifted to her, not sharply, not in a way that would draw attention, but with a precision that cut through everything else, focusing entirely on her presence, on the connection between them, on the way it responded in that moment. Bellatrix met it immediately, her expression composed, her awareness steady, but beneath that steadiness, something had changed. Not enough to break anything, but enough to be noticed. "You understand what this becomes," he said quietly, his voice low, controlled, carrying a weight that extended beyond the words themselves. It was not a question. Bellatrix held his gaze, her lips curving slightly, not into the wild, consuming smile she once wore, but into something quieter, more certain, something that reflected the depth of what she had come to understand. "Yes," she replied softly. And she did. She understood that this was no longer about forcing him to love her, no longer about leverage or control or even influence in the way she had once defined it. It was about something far more complex, something that existed between them now, something that could not be reduced to a single intention or outcome. And the closer she got to it, the more it would change everything. Voldemort did not hesitate when the moment came, because hesitation was not something he allowed himself, not in action, not in thought, not in anything that required decision, and yet what he chose to do now was not something that fit cleanly into the framework he had built his existence upon, because it was not simply control, not simply strategy, not simply the calculated use of a tool that had proven itself effective. It was acceptance, not of weakness, but of reality, of the fact that the bond could not be undone, could not be reduced, could not be contained without diminishing something that had already begun to enhance what he was capable of. He did not name it. He did not acknowledge it in any way that would suggest it held power over him. But he acted on it. The shift was immediate. Not outwardly dramatic, not something that would draw attention from the others in a way that could be easily identified, but within the bond, within the space that existed between him and Bellatrix, it was unmistakable. The boundaries he had constructed, the careful limitations he had imposed, the controlled distance he had maintained even as he began to use the connection more deliberately, all of it shifted at once, not disappearing, but opening, expanding in a way that allowed the bond to function without restraint for the first time since he had understood what it truly was. Bellatrix felt it the moment it happened, not as pressure, not as intrusion, but as something that settled into place with a clarity that stole the breath from her lungs, her awareness sharpening, expanding, aligning with his in a way that was deeper, more complete than anything she had experienced before. It was not forced. It was allowed. And that made it entirely different. Her body stilled, not out of caution, not out of fear, but because movement suddenly felt irrelevant, the world around her fading into something distant as the connection took precedence over everything else. She did not have to reach for it this time. She did not have to navigate its edges or search for its weaknesses. It opened to her as easily as it opened to him, the space between them dissolving into something that was no longer defined by separation, but by convergence. Bellatrix felt his awareness with a clarity that was almost overwhelming, not as something external brushing against her thoughts, but as something that existed alongside them, distinct but inseparable, precise, cold, and utterly focused. Across from her, Lord Voldemort did not look away. He allowed it. That was the difference. Where before he had controlled every interaction, measured every moment of overlap, ensured that nothing passed through the bond without his direction, now he stepped into it fully, not recklessly, not without awareness of what he was doing, but without restriction. He did not lose himself in it. He did not blur into her. But he allowed the connection to exist at its full depth, and in doing so, he exposed something he had never allowed to be seen. Not emotion. Not weakness. But structure. Bellatrix felt it as clearly as she felt her own thoughts, the way his mind moved, the way it organized, the way every action, every decision, every intention aligned into something singular and absolute. It was not chaotic. It was not layered with conflicting impulses. It was streamlined, efficient, almost inhuman in its precision, and for the first time, she understood not just how he thought, but why he could not be what she had once wanted him to be. There was no space in him for anything that did not serve a purpose. No room for attachment that was not functional. No place for anything that could not be controlled. And yet, the bond existed. And he had chosen to step into it. That was the fracture. Small. But undeniable. Bellatrix felt it as clearly as everything else, that subtle misalignment between what he was and what he was allowing, the moment where his perfect structure adapted to something it had not been built to accommodate. It did not break him. It did not weaken him. But it changed the shape of something that had once been absolute. Her breath caught. Not because she was overwhelmed. But because she understood. "You chose this," she said softly, her voice steady despite the intensity of what flowed between them, the words not a challenge, not a question, but a recognition of what had just happened. He did not deny it. Because he could not. The connection remained open, not fluctuating, not unstable, but steady, fully realized in a way that made everything they had experienced before feel incomplete by comparison. Voldemort's gaze remained fixed on her, his awareness not just touching hers, but existing alongside it in a way that left no space for illusion. "I chose to use what exists," he replied, his voice as controlled as ever, but carrying something beneath it that had not been there before, not emotion, not softness, but something closer to acknowledgement.